So now that the web was catching the attention of the public, let's take a look at some numbers that are interesting numbers that really kind of paint a picture about how much growth there was in such a short period of time. And by the way, just to be clear, the reason I need to make you all aware of all of this is to really drive home the point that the people, that is the users, the early web developers, and the IT folks, were really making things up as they went along. It was like the wild, wild west in those early days. And standards, kind of like the frontier sheriff in town, the best that they could do was post the law of the land, but really it was more like the settlers that made up their own rules as they went along. So by 1993, the web was starting to take off. And before that point, there were only about, if you remember, I was talking about like 20 web servers worldwide, and most of them were limited to research and academic institutions. But by the end of that same year, that number had already grown to 200 web servers right after the release of the Mosaic browser. And then in 1994, it was Mark Andreessen and the rest of the browser team left their jobs at NCSA to create the Netscape Communications Company. And they launched the Netscape Navigator browser based on what they had already developed with Mosaic. And then the number of users shot up to about 3 million worldwide, which included me, by the way. And that drove the number of web servers to around 2,700 or so in just that short time. And in that same year, something interesting started happening inside big companies, inside like Fortune 100 companies like Xerox, Kodak, IBM, and HP. Their IT departments started quietly registering domain names just in case. Because back then, upper management, basically saw the web as just a curiosity, if at all. Not something that they needed any attention from from their marketing departments or the C-suite. So who was setting up these first corporate websites? Often it was the IT staff or some forward-thinking engineers or some hobbyists, that were inside the company. And the result was we started seeing early .com websites popping up. Most of them were minimalist or uncoordinated, no consistent branding, and no corporate strategy. It was just a placeholder for the company to have a presence on the web. And it would take another year or two before the executives realized the web's potential for marketing, for customer support, and eventually e-commerce. But in 1994, it was still just an experiment driven by the people inside the organizations that saw what was coming. So as I mentioned previously, those numbers caught the eye of Microsoft. In 1995, they released the Internet Explorer web browser, initially bundled with the Windows 95 Plus pack as an optional add-on. But then they followed up in 1996 by integrating Internet Explorer, or just IE for short, directly in the Windows operating system. In other words, if you had a computer running Windows, then you already had the Internet Explorer web browser. So their market share shot up to approximately like 95% over the next few years, basically decimating all other entrants in the market, including Netscape's Navigator browser, which fell below 5% or so by the early 2000s. So that bundling strategy, offering a free browser with every Windows installation, was really effective. And Internet Explorer became the default web browser for just about everyone who used the web everywhere. And at the same time, arguably because Microsoft's push to put a web browser into everyone's hands, the number of internet users jumped to about 70 million worldwide, and that in turn drove the number of web servers to about 1.2 million by around 1997. So good old Microsoft, huh? That's arguable. Their near total domination of the browser market came with some trade-offs, and the dominance itself came under question by pre-installing Internet Explorer on every Windows computer and making it default. Basically, they locked in their browser's dominance, and that came under some questions, whether it was an unfair business practice, which is a big topic unto itself. But for us web developers, the bigger issue was this, is that any sense of standards were falling apart. Microsoft's Internet Explorer they were basically free to do their own thing by adding non-standard features and quirks that often broke websites in other browsers. And the running joke back then, which not a joke, was, you know the nice thing about standards? There's so many of them. So let that sink in. As web developers, that meant we had to write special code and hacks just to get the websites to work in Internet Explorer. Even if they work perfectly in other web browsers, you'd spend hours tweaking the code just to handle IE's broken rendering engine. What we had to do was frustrating. It was time-consuming, and we felt like we were building the same website twice, once for the web and once just for Microsoft's Internet Explorer. And then came the backlash. So Microsoft's aggressive push with Internet Explorer didn't just frustrate developers, it caught the attention of regulators. Because in 1998, the US Department of Justice, along with 20 state attorneys generals, filed an antitrust lawsuit against Microsoft, arguing that bundling Internet Explorer with Windows was an abuse of monopoly power. The case dragged on for years, and it exposed Microsoft's internal tactics to undercut Netscape and maintain control over the browser market. In 2000, a judge ruled that Microsoft had violated antitrust rules. And at one point, there was even talk of breaking the company up into separate parts. But in the end, a settlement was reached, and they required Microsoft to share some of the APIs with third-party companies to allow PC manufacturers to remove Internet Explorer from the desktop, which didn't kill Internet Explorer's dominance overnight, but just the process of questioning Microsoft's dominance in the market in the around 1990s, it opened the door for competition to return. So competition took years to recover, but Netscape's business, well, it declined. But its team made a bold move before their total demise to release the Netscape Navigator codebase as open source in 1998, which launched the Mozilla project. And that eventually produced the Firefox browser a couple years later in 2004, which was a faster, standards-based browser focused on user control and privacy. And so with that, Firefox gained a loyal following, and they began chipping away at Microsoft's market share. And it also gave developers and users a real alternative again, signaling that browser diversity and healthy competition were slowly returning to the web. So around the same time, Apple launched Safari, built on its new WebKit rendering engine. Google released Chrome in 2008, initially also using WebKit. And later they adopted Blink, which was just a fork of the WebKit rendering engine in about 2013. So as it ended up, Chrome redefined user expectations for speed and simplicity, and they quickly overtook their competition to become the world's most popular browser today. Today, Chrome holds a healthy but not unfair about 60% of the global browser market across both desktop and mobile platforms. So quick sidebar, so what is a rendering engine? So every web browser is built on top of a piece of software called a rendering engine, and that's the part that takes the HTML and the CSS and the JavaScript code that we write and put into a web page and turns it into what the user sees on a screen. So different web browsers use different engines, and those engines play a huge role in how fast and compatible and how, mostly important, standards compliant a web browser is. So back when there was all this trouble with Microsoft, Trident powered Internet Explorer, Gecko powered Firefox, and WebKit powered Safari, and Blink, which was an extension of WebKit, powered Chrome. So the choice of engine affects not only speed, but how accurately the browser interprets the web standards, and whether developers need to do weird things to build and insert a lot of workarounds to get their websites to display correctly in all of these other web browsers. So today, major web browsers they've all pretty much converged around just a few engines. So Chrome still uses Blink, which was a fork of WebKit. Safari also continues to use WebKit, but their version of it, which Apple maintains and optimizes, especially for their Mac OS and iOS platforms. Firefox does their own thing, and they still use their own Gecko engine because they want to, they keep their focus on maintaining independence while prioritizing open standards and user privacy. Interestingly, Microsoft Edge, which originally used the Trident engine, switched to Blink in 2020, making it basically the same browser like Chrome. Because of this, Blink via Chromium is now the most widely used rendering engine globally, powering Chrome and Edge and other browsers like Brave and Opera and a few others. So while this helps with consistency for us developers, it also starts to raise some questions about engine diversity because so many browsers now rely on the same core technology. But at the end of the day, for us developers, it's mostly a win. The convergence around, just a few rendering engines means that we spend a lot less time on compatibility and testing and weird troubleshooting and a lot more time just actually building good websites. So I guess one way to wrap this up is, to say that finally the lawlessness of the wild web came under the rule of law and the law of standards. And what began as a chaotic scramble slowly gave way to shared guidelines, letting us developers build with confidence. And so our sites would work across browsers and all devices. And who is that sheriff that brought order to this new frontier? It was a consortium, the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C, which stepped in to help set the standards that would shape the web's future. And we'll talk about what happened with them in the next lecture.